The kingdom of Azura, a once proud civilization nestled in the heart of a lush and vibrant world, now stood on the precipice of collapse. The kingdom's golden fields, their harvests once bountiful, now lay barren. Towering citadels that once housed scholars, leaders, and warriors were now empty, abandoned by the people fleeing the endless war. The forces of Veridon, the ruthless empire of steel and fire, had encircled Azura, leaving no room for hope. Prince Cedric, the heir to Azura's throne, stood alone atop the highest tower of the royal palace. His eyes, once filled with the promise of a bright future, now stared blankly into the darkened horizon. The war was lost in his world. His people were on the brink of annihilation. The invasion had been swift and brutal. The Empire of Veridon was relentless, crushing any resistance with their superior technology and vast armies. And now it had come to this. His people would either surrender or they would burn. The kingdom's council had already surrendered, signing a peace treaty that offered Azura's unconditional submission to Veridon's rule. But there was one more measure of survival left, one that Cedric could not fathom but knew he had no choice but to accept. The door to the balcony creaked open behind him, and his father, King Alistair, entered the room. His once imposing figure was hunched now, weighed down by years of ruling a crumbling world. His eyes, though aged, still burned with the same fire they had in his youth. But even he was defeated. "Cedric." The king's voice faltered, a quiet desperation in his tone. "The princess has arrived. The alliance is agreed upon." The princess. Her name alone stirred a mixture of loathing and helplessness within Cedric. Princess Selene of Veridon. She was the daughter of Emperor Riven, the mastermind behind the invasion. For months, her empire had steadily crushed Azura's defenses, leaving the kingdom with no choice but to bend the knee. It was her imperial fleet that had annihilated Azura's military forces, her ships that loomed like a dark cloud over their world. But now, Cedric faced an even more unbearable fate, an alliance through marriage. In the chambers below, Princess Selene waited, her beauty as cold and calculating as her empire's ambitions. Cedric could feel her presence before he even stepped into the room. She was the enemy, the embodiment of the destruction that had ravaged his people. He had always imagined meeting her on the battlefield, where he could face her as an enemy leader. But now this was different. This was betrayal. As Cedric entered the chamber, he was greeted not with hostility, but with silence. Selene stood by the window, her back to him, gazing out over the royal gardens that had once been a symbol of Azura's strength and wealth. There was no warmth in her eyes, no sign of empathy or remorse. She was the princess of the very empire that had brought them to their knees. Prince Cedric. Her voice was smooth, almost like a blade cutting through the tension in the room. She turned to face him, her icy gaze meeting his. "I see you finally come to terms with the inevitable." "I don't have a choice," Cedric replied, his voice colder than he intended. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "No," she said softly, almost too calmly. "You don't." There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it pity? Or perhaps guilt? Cedric couldn't be sure. "This union will save your world. Your people will be spared the final blow of my father's wrath." Cedric's heart burned with a mixture of anger and sorrow. He had never imagined his fate would be sealed by such a cruel, unnatural bond. His people, his kingdom. They were on the edge of extinction, and the price of survival was a life bound to an enemy princess. A woman who had caused his world nothing but suffering. "You think this will save them?" Cedric spat, unable to contain his frustration. "You think marrying you will stop the destruction you brought? The blood you spilled? You're just like your father, heartless and unforgiving." Selene's expression hardened, but she didn't react with anger. Instead, she walked slowly toward him, her steps deliberate. "You may think me cruel, Prince Cedric, but I'm not the one who started this war. My father, he chose to invade. He chose to destroy. But I am not my father." She paused, her eyes searching his. "And neither are you." Her words were a knife to his heart. In her gaze, there was no malice, no contempt, just a recognition of two people trapped in a war they didn't choose. "Then why?" Cedric asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why am I here? Why did you come to me?" Celine took a step closer, her presence commanding but not threatening. Because this marriage is the only way to end the bloodshed. If I marry you, my father will be forced to acknowledge that Azra has surrendered, and the destruction will stop. Your people will live, and your world will survive. Cedric couldn't deny the logic of her words. If he married her, his people would be spared. The war would end. His people, who had fought so hard and so long, could finally rest. But at what cost? His dignity? His honor? His freedom? Celine watched him struggle with the decision, her face unreadable. I do not expect you to embrace this union with joy, Prince Cedric, but it is the only way. I, too, have my role to play. Cedric looked down at the floor, a deep sense of loss flooding him. His heart was torn between the duty to his people and the shame of being forced into an alliance with the enemy. But what other choice did he have? To refuse would mean the death of Azra. To accept would mean the death of everything he had ever believed in. The weight of the decision was crushing. Finally, Cedric raised his head to meet her gaze. When does it begin? Celine's expression softened, just for a moment, before it hardened once more. Tomorrow, the room fell silent. The future of Azra, and perhaps even the galaxy, hinged on the words they had just spoken. And in that silence, Cedric knew he had just made a decision that would change everything. The days that followed were a blur of forced civility and cold diplomacy. Cedric, Prince of Azra, now found himself in the heart of Veridan's empire, a prisoner in a gilded cage. His marriage to Princess Celine, a union born of necessity rather than affection, loomed over him like an unyielding shadow. The war that had once consumed his every thought now seemed distant, replaced by the harsh reality of his new life as the consort of the enemy. The grand halls of Veridan's capital were cold and imposing, their black marble floors and high ceilings more fitting for a conqueror than a prince who had once ruled over lush gardens and thriving cities. Cedric could feel the weight of history in every step he took within these walls, an empire built in the ruins of countless worlds, his world included. But despite the lavish surroundings, he felt more like a ghost than a man. His identity, his role as a prince, had been stripped away, leaving only a hollow shell of who he once was. On the night before their formal wedding, Celine had asked him to meet her in the royal gardens under the cloak of twilight. She had wanted to speak with him, not as a princess and a prince, but as two people thrown into an impossible situation. The garden was both beautiful and haunting, with twisting, silver trees and fountains that gurgled softly in the background. The moonlight cast long shadows, and the scent of the flowers, though fragrant, felt heavy with unspoken words. Cedric had been waiting for her by the central fountain when she arrived, her figure a silhouette against the dim glow of the distant palace lights. There was no fanfare, no retinue of guards following her, just the two of them in the quiet, still night. "You didn't have to come," Cedric said, his voice strained. It was an effort to mask the bitterness that had settled deep in his chest since their last conversation. "I wanted to," Celine replied, her tone calm, but there was something in her eyes that caught Cedric off guard. "I've been thinking a lot about this marriage, about everything." "Thinking? About what?" Cedric's words were sharper than he intended, the anger from earlier still bubbling beneath the surface. He fought to keep his emotions in check, but it was becoming harder with each passing day. "You've made your choice. My people are saved because of it. That's all there is to it." Celine didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she stepped closer, the cool breeze stirring her dark hair. "It's not that simple. We're not just playing a game of chess where you sacrifice a piece to save the kingdom. You're a man, Cedric, not just some token of peace. I know this marriage was forced upon you, and I know it's tearing you apart." Cedric felt a strange tightening in his chest at her words. It was a fleeting moment of vulnerability between them, an acknowledgement that, perhaps, they were both trapped in this situation, each playing a part in a war neither had started. "I never wanted this," Cedric confessed, the weight of his own words sinking in. "But what choice do I have? I either marry you or my people perish. You win. End of story." Celine's gaze softened, and for the first time, Cedric saw something other than the cold, calculating princess he had been forced to marry. There was a flicker of something, an emotion he couldn't quite name. I didn't want this either, she whispered. But I've been taught my entire life to put my people above everything, even my happiness. Her words hung in the air like a fragile promise. Cedric studied her, the princess who had been groomed to rule with an iron fist, the woman who had led her empire to conquer his world. There was a depth to her he had never seen before, a side of her that wasn't just a warrior, but a person struggling with her own demons. I understand your pain, Celine continued, her voice steady despite the vulnerability she had shown. I don't know if this marriage will ever mean anything more than a political alliance, but I want to make it bearable. For both of us. Cedric remained silent, unsure of how to respond. He had expected her to be cold and indifferent. He had expected her to see him as nothing more than a tool, someone to secure peace. But this woman, standing before him, was no longer an enemy. She was something more. And yet, despite this fragile connection between them, he couldn't allow himself to forget the truth. She was still the enemy, still a part of the empire that had destroyed his world. The wedding is tomorrow, he said, his voice suddenly distant. You've won. My world is yours. But don't expect me to forget what's been done. Not yet. Celine nodded, her expression unreadable. I don't expect you to. But I hope that one day you'll see me for who I am, and not just as a daughter of the man who destroyed your kingdom. The wedding ceremony the next day was a lavish affair, as expected for such an event. The great hall of Veridin's palace was adorned with the finest tapestries, golden filigree gleaming under the chandeliers, and guests from all corners of the empire gathered to witness the union of their princess with the Prince of Azura. Cedric, dressed in his ceremonial attire, stood at the altar, a figure of royal dignity, though inside he felt as though his very soul had been shackled. His mind raced with thoughts of his people, those he had lost, those he had failed. His heart, however, was conflicted, torn between duty and the strange, fragile connection he now shared with Celine. When Celine entered the hall, the world seemed to still. Her presence was commanding, her beauty undeniable, but there was no triumph in her gaze, no sense of victory. As she walked toward him, Cedric saw not an enemy princess, but a woman forced into a role she had never chosen. They exchanged vows in a cold, formal ceremony, and the moment they were married, the weight of it all settled between them. There was no joy, no celebration, just the crushing sense of an obligation fulfilled. And yet, as the final word was spoken, something shifted ever so slightly. Their marriage was not just a political tool, but a bond that tied them together, for better or worse. Later that evening, in the privacy of their royal chambers, Cedric couldn't shake the sense that something had changed. Celine, standing by the window as she gazed out the city below, seemed distant, lost in thought. He had expected her to be cold, to retreat into the role of the imperial princess, but instead, she seemed human. She seemed unsure, uncertain. Is this it? Cedric asked, his voice quieter than before. Is this really all we are? Just a political pawn in a game we didn't start. Celine turned toward him, her expression unreadable. I wish it were that simple. But we both know this is just the beginning. What happens next will define everything. The days following the wedding were a haze of new responsibilities, political maneuvering, and an uncomfortable silence that permeated the vast halls of Veridin's palace. The marriage, though intended to bring peace between their worlds, had not erased the distrust that lingered between Cedric and Celine. They were bound by duty, but the emotional chasm between them remained vast, and it seemed impossible to bridge. Cedric had expected their life together to be a series of formalities, public appearances, speeches, and the occasional diplomatic event. He had thought that perhaps, after the initial shock, they would fall into a cold routine, each going through the motions of their roles. But he quickly learned that there was more to his new life than he had anticipated. His days were consumed with the intricate politics of Veridin, and his nights were filled with uneasy silence as he lay beside a woman he could barely understand, much less trust. But everything changed one evening, when a coup within the empire threatened to unravel everything. It started with a whisper, just a hushed rumor circulating among the palace staff. An assassination plot against Princess Celine. At first, it seemed like little more than palace gossip, the kind of talk that surfaced in the wake of any major political shift. But when Cedric was summoned to the War Council late one night, he found that the rumors were all too real. There was a faction within Veridon, a group of disgruntled nobles and military leaders who wanted to remove Selene from power. "Your marriage hasn't gone unnoticed, Prince Cedric," General Kalen, one of the highest-ranking officials in Veridon's military, said grimly. "Many in the Empire see it as a betrayal. They view it as a weakening of our control over the galaxy. They'll stop at nothing to see your union undone." Cedric's chest tightened as he processed the information. The threat was not just political, it was personal. Selene's life was in danger, and though their marriage was born out of necessity, Cedric found that he could not stand by and allow her to be harmed. Not after everything that had happened, not after everything they had shared. For the first time since their wedding, he felt a sense of clarity. This was no longer just about his people or hers. It was about saving the woman who, despite everything, had shown him a side of herself that was more human than he had ever expected. "Then we must act quickly," Cedric said, his voice steely with determination. "We cannot let this faction destabilize the Empire. If we act now, we can protect the throne and you." Selene, who had been silent during the meeting, looked at him with a mixture of surprise and something deeper, an emotion he couldn't quite read. "You will help me?" she asked, her voice soft but piercing. Cedric nodded, his gaze unwavering. "You may not be my ally by birth, princess, but you are my ally now, and I will not allow your empire to fall into chaos, especially not the hands of traitors." For a moment, Selene seemed to hesitate, as though she were weighing his words. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Very well, Prince Cedric. Let's ensure that your decision is not one you'll regret." The next few days were a blur of strategy meetings, clandestine discussions, and tense covert operations. Cedric was thrust into a world he had never anticipated, one filled with spies, double-dealing, and political maneuvering. It was a world where trust was a luxury, and every move could mean the difference between life and death. But what struck him the most was how, in the midst of this chaos, he and Selene began to work together, really work together. For the first time since their marriage, the initial meetings had been tense, with Cedric still unsure of Selene's true intentions and Selene wary of his involvement. But as they spent more time in each other's company, the cracks in their emotional armor began to widen. They began to understand each other, not as enemies, not as pawns, but as individuals trying to survive in a world that seemed intent on destroying them. It wasn't long before Cedric saw the depth of Selene's intelligence and her capacity for leadership. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was a force in her own right, a woman who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of her empire and come out on top. Cedric found himself not only admiring her strength, but also questioning everything he had once believed about her and her empire. One evening, as they prepared for a major diplomatic event that would solidify their alliance, Selene and Cedric found themselves in a quiet moment together in the palace's war room. The tension between them had softened, but there was still a weight to their conversations, an unspoken understanding that things had changed between them. "I never thought this would be how things would turn out," Cedric said, staring out the window at the sprawling city below. "I never thought I would be here, in this position, working alongside the enemy. And yet here we are." Selene was silent for a moment before she spoke, her voice calm but laced with a hint of vulnerability. "I never imagined this either, that I would have to marry you, let alone rely on you to protect me." She paused, then added, "You know, I've spent my whole life training to lead an empire, to command armies and make decisions for the good of my people. But I never realized how lonely it would be, how hard it is to trust anyone." Cedric turned to look at her, surprised by the raw honesty in her voice. It was a side of her he hadn't expected, the woman who had always been composed, always in control, now showing him a glimpse of the weight she carried every day. "You don't have to do it alone," Cedric said quietly. "I'm here, and if nothing else, I'll make sure that whatever happens, you don't face it alone." For the first time, Selene smiled, small, almost imperceptible, but genuine. And in that moment, Cedric realized something that had eluded him until now. Despite their past, despite the war that had defined their lives, they were no longer enemies. They were something more, something unexpected. They were allies, working together for the first time, not out of obligation, but because they had no other choice. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough. Over the next few weeks, Cedric and Celine continued to build a fragile alliance, one that was tested by the ever-present threat of rebellion from within the Empire. They found themselves in countless situations where they had to rely on each other, their differences slowly fading into the background as the danger around them grew. And in the midst of the chaos, they began to form a bond that would change everything. Their alliance wasn't just political anymore. It was personal. And despite the odds, despite the pain of their past, they had found something they never expected: trust. The alliance between Cedric and Celine, forged in the fires of necessity, had become something neither of them had expected. What began as a marriage born of duty, a desperate attempt to save his people and bring peace, had transformed into a partnership that neither of them could deny. As the days passed and their bond deepened, Cedric came to realize that Celine was no longer just the enemy princess. She was a woman trapped in her father's empire, just as he had once been trapped by his own responsibilities. But even as their trust grew, the darkness of their respective worlds loomed over them. The Empire of Veridon, once unified under Emperor Riven's iron rule, was now fractured. The coup that had been brewing from within had reached its breaking point. Celine's own allies, her generals, trusted advisors, had begun to turn on her, plotting not just against her throne but against the fragile peace she had worked so hard to secure. In the days following their covert operations to root out the traitors, Celine found herself standing at the precipice of a decision that would define not just her future, but the fate of both her empire and Cedric's world. Her father, Emperor Riven, had once been a man of ambition, but now he was a man broken by his own greed, his insatiable desire for power. She could no longer follow him. She could no longer be complicit in his destruction. "I'm going to do it," Celine said one evening as they sat alone in the palace's strategy room. The maps of the Empire, covered in pins and notes, were spread out before them. "I'm going to confront my father. I can't allow him to destroy what we fought for." Cedric looked up at her, his heart heavy. He had known this moment was coming. The choice was inevitable. The Emperor would never accept the change Celine was willing to make. And once she made that choice, there would be no turning back. "You know what that means, right?" Cedric's voice was grave. "If you confront your father, there's no guarantee you'll survive. No guarantee this empire will survive. You'll be casting yourself out." Celine's gaze softened, but her resolve was unwavering. "I've already cast myself out, Cedric. By marrying you, by choosing peace over conquest. But I will not stand by while my father continues his war on the galaxy, while he destroys the people we've sworn to protect." She rose from the table, her posture regal yet burdened. "I've spent my life under the shadow of my father's empire. His vision for the galaxy was always about domination. But I've seen the damage it's done, how it's crippled everything we were supposed to protect. No more. I won't let him take everything down with him, not even for my blood." Cedric stood as well, his hand tightening on the edge of the table. His heart ached for her. He had always seen her as a princess of Veridon, an enemy to be feared. But now he saw the woman behind the title, a woman who had been forced into a role she could never have chosen. He had seen the courage in her eyes when she stood up to her own empire, and he couldn't let her face it alone. "I'll stand with you," Cedric said, his voice firm. "Whatever happens, I won't let you face him alone. You've already saved my world. Now I'll help you save yours." For a moment, Celine's eyes flickered with emotion. Something raw, something real. Then she nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they had formed, something deeper than just a political alliance. In that moment, they were not just ruler and prince. They were allies, equals, fighting for a better future. The confrontation was inevitable. It came on the eve of a final council meeting, where Celine would announce her decision to take the throne for herself, to overthrow her father and usher in a new era for Veridon. But before she could make her move, Cedric and Celine learned a horrifying plan, one that would destroy not only Veridon, but also Azura. The Emperor had prepared a doomsday weapon, one that could obliterate entire planets in seconds. His empire was crumbling, and rather than lose it, he intended to take the galaxy with him. Celine's blood ran cold when she learned of the weapon, and the urgency of the situation hit them both like a hammer. They had no time to waste. It was now or never. "We can't let him use this," Celine said, her voice low and filled with determination. "We can't let him have the power to destroy everything we've worked for." Together, they made their way to the Emperor's stronghold, deep in the heart of Veridan's capital. The corridors were dark and quiet, the shadows of the Empire's collapse weighing heavily on every step. As they approached the throne room, Cedric could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on both of them. This was not just a rebellion. It was a fight for their future and for the future of their worlds. Inside the throne room, Emperor Riven awaited them. His presence was as commanding as ever, though age and desperation had begun to wear on him. His cold eyes fixed on Celine as she entered, and for a moment there was silence. "You would betray me, Celine?" Riven's voice was low, like the growl of a beast trapped in a corner. "You, my daughter, would turn against your own blood?" "I'm not turning against you, father," Celine said, her voice steady. "I'm turning against the empire you built, the empire that's been built on blood and destruction. I won't be a part of it anymore." Riven's gaze flickered toward Cedric, then back to Celine. "You think you can save this galaxy, girl? You think you can undo everything I've done?" "I think I can try," Celine said quietly, "and I think I'll succeed." The final confrontation was brutal and swift. Riven, in a moment of madness, attempted to activate the Doomsday weapon, but it was too late. Celine and Cedric had anticipated his every move. With the weapon disabled, Riven's empire collapsed in an instant. His forces turned against him, his reign shattered. As the dust settled, Celine stood at the head of the throne room, victorious but solemn. She had done it. The empire of Veridan was no more, and a new dawn was on the horizon. But it was a victory tainted with sacrifice. Her father, her blood, lay defeated before her. And while the galaxy had been saved, the price of peace had been steep. Cedric stood by her side, his present a silent vow to stand with her, no matter what came next. "What now?" he asked, his voice soft. Celine looked out across the throne room, her gaze distant. "Now, we rebuild. Together." And in that moment, Cedric knew that the woman who had once been his enemy had become something more, something that transcended politics, war, and the empire she had been born into. She had saved him in ways he never could have imagined. She had saved not just his world, but his soul. As they left the throne room together, the first rays of dawn broke through the darkness, and with them a new era began.